Thanks for joining us tonight for Criminalization and Homelessness Beyond Grants Pass. This is part of the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless's Education Series 2024. We do this series on the third Thursday of most months of the year, not 12 months a year, but about nine. My name is Alexis Whittem. I am the Director of Communications for the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, and really appreciate you all taking the time to join us. First, we'll go ahead and start with a bit of housekeeping. So if you could go next slide, thank you. So we do have Zoom captioning available. If you would like to see captions, they are AI captions, so they're not going to be perfect. But if you would like to see captions, just go to the bottom of your screen and you'll see CC show captions, and then they will automatically appear. We did not have any requests today for any interpretation in another language, so we don't have that available. But if you are a non-English speaker, you may want to catch it on YouTube later where they have auto translation, and we'll have it up by tomorrow or Monday. Our formats for today is our usual format that we do most of the time. We have a presentation to start with data. It sort of sets the stage for what we're going to do tonight, what we're going to talk about with criminalization. We're talking national, we're talking local, just to sort of set the stage so we're all on the same page. Then we do a panel with some local experts and planned questions. So we have those all planned out. And then we hit the Q&A, which is the time when we ask questions from you all that you've put into the Q&A function. So in order to do that, you're just going to use the Q&A button at the bottom and ask a question there. Please do use the Q&A function to ask the questions rather than the chat. The chat is for introducing yourself to others. We get lots of people who work in the sector here, and so you may want to make connections, say hello. Please do use the chat for that. We also will sometimes add a link in the chat that's useful, like if we reference an article, something of that nature. Sometimes you'll see it in the chat so that you can find it. I will also mention that that data presentation at the beginning, we do send out to anyone who registered for this event. So if you've registered, you're here. You'll get an email. It'll have a link to this video so that you could watch it or share it later. It'll also have the data presentation. So you don't have to take notes, just enjoy it and then learn from it. And then you can have all that information after the fact. As participants on this webinar, your cameras and microphones are off. So if you're doing dishes, driving, it's very easy to watch and participate in this webinar. Only the panelists have cameras on and microphones on. And so please do use the chat function and Q&A function to communicate with others. Once again, the session's being recorded. We just like to let folks know that. And finally, if you want to share on social media, sometimes during, sometimes after, we use the hashtag CCHEdSeries. And then those handles there at the bottom of the screen are all of the organizations that are part of today. If you want to tweet at us or exit us, whatever it may be. If you need those later and you missed this slide, just put something in the chat, and one of the wonderful team members from the education and advocacy team here at the coalition is able to help. So with that, I will hand this off to Andrew West, who's going to do our data presentation on criminalization and homelessness that'll set the stage for our panel. So Andrew?
Thank you so much, Alexis, for kicking it off and introducing me. My name is Andrew West. I am the policy associate here with the Coalition for the Homeless, and I'll give a bit of a data overview, a bit of level setting before we turn to our excellent panel tonight. Just a quick note, we've chosen the language criminalization of homelessness rather than criminal justice or crime, because we're talking about criminalization as both a policy choice and as a practice. This is a thing that is ongoing, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. And we'll talk in the end, and we'll hear from our panelists what some alternatives might be. But generally, we're talking about measures that make basic daily life activities that are often required just to stay alive, making those activities a crime for people who are unhoused. The National Coalition to End Homelessness describes measures that prohibit life-sustaining activities such as sleeping or camping, eating, sitting, and or asking for money or resources in public spaces. These ordinances include criminal penalties for violation of these acts. And we know from a lot of data on our work at the coalition, as well as a 2016 report that shows that people experiencing homelessness are no more likely to commit crimes than those who are housed. The main difference in that is crimes of poverty and these camping ordinances and other measures that prohibit life-sustaining activities that we'll be focusing on today. So what are some of these measures? A lot of the times they can be categorized under quality of life ordinances or camping bans, but generally these are measures that carry out forced displacement. You'll hear us refer to those as sweeps throughout the night, where people have personal property confiscated, including tents, bedding, papers, clothing, medications, identification, etc. Anything that someone has with them. Um, Making panhandling illegal, making it illegal for groups to share food with unhoused individuals in public spaces. And the general purpose of these is rather than solving homelessness, obviously pushing someone along doesn't change their material situation in any way, but it's really to get people who are experiencing homelessness out of sight and out of public spaces much of the time. And why are people criminalized? Why is this sort of the default response? When people are experiencing homelessness and are sleeping on the streets, oftentimes the police are called in to respond. And since there are so many frequent interactions with police and law enforcement, it has really few response options besides taking people to a jail or a hospital or a detox center. A lot of these things are considered crimes. And again, I'll note that a lot of these behaviors that we'll be talking about today, such as camping, sleeping, sitting, lying down, loitering, storing property, sharing food, are all required to just survive, to live daily life, and are not crimes for those of us who have housing. And again, this is a policy choice that we have made. And when we talk about criminalization, I think it's really important to note differences in criminalization based on race. And last month in our Ed series, we covered the intersection of race and homelessness and how those two things are related, particularly for Black individuals. So I will note that housed Black people are incarcerated more than 5 times the rate of people who are white, and the imprisonment rate for Black women is twice that of whites. Um, this is also true for people who are unhoused, and Black unhoused person are about 10 times more likely than whites to receive a citation for laws that criminalize homelessness. So even within the unhoused community, we see pretty stark discrepancies based on race for who is criminalized under these statutes. And women as well, especially women of color, are more likely than men to experience homelessness after past incarceration. And we'll talk a bit more later about the um, intricate nature of how incarceration is tied to homelessness. So one thing that we say all the time at the coalition is that camping bans are not an effective strategy to resolve homelessness. Instead, they create mistrust between law enforcement and unhoused people. It also makes it much more difficult to access critical outreach and assistive services. If you're focusing on just where is all my stuff, how do I focus on the immediate needs of being displaced forcibly, of being swept along. Um, and it can result in confiscated property, having to regain one's property. If it's been moved somewhere else, you have to go pick that up. And it really interrupts services and interrupts the process of trying to regain stability, as well as sleep deprivation and exposure. These sweeps and forced displacements can be especially harmful during cold winter months. And a lot of these times, camping bans try to get people off the streets and into shelters, or at least that is the stated purpose. And we've talked about this before in other ed series and other communications, but there are many rational reasons that someone might choose to remain unsheltered and sleep on the streets rather than stay in a shelter. It might be just the conditions of the shelter. It might be that you're not allowed to bring a pet or other bring pets in. You might not be able to stay with a partner if the shelters are um, separated by gender. You might not be able to bring your personal possessions in, etc. There are lots of rational reasons why someone might choose not to do that. Um, and these laws are not only exceedingly common, they have been more prevalent in recent years. Between 2006 and 2019, laws prohibiting camping in public increased by 92%. And there's a 2016 report that found among Colorado's 76 largest cities, there's a total of 351 anti-homeless ordinances, or so these measures that we talk about that are criminalizing people. So, in the local sense to Denver, the Denver camping ban was signed into law in May 2012. That passed through City Council and was signed by Mayor Hancock and has been pretty controversial over the last 10 or so years. but has allowed the city to criminalize individuals who are experiencing homelessness for camping on the streets. Um, there was a measure in 2019 that was Initiative 300. It was known as the Right to Survive in Public Spaces measure, uh, which would have allowed and secured the right to rest, eat, and shelter in outdoor public spaces as well as one's vehicle. So this allows you to rest, shelter, eat, exchange food, or occupy your vehicle in a legally parked space. Um, and that measure failed. It was voted about 81% of the votes casted in that year were no votes. So that measure did not pass. In other jurisdictions, in 2022, Colorado Springs City Council approved an expansion of an ordinance that, similar to a camping ban, prevents anyone from sitting, lying, kneeling, or reclining in public spaces such as sidewalks, trails, alleys, parks. And in 2024, more recently, Grand Junction banned the use of tents in city parks during the daytime. Uh, this extended their measure that prohibited overnight camping, except in cases where shelter beds are full. And in 2024, Pueblo also made it illegal to camp on public property. So there are a lot of different kinds of these measures. They might sometimes look a little bit different, but they all have the same sort of goal of pushing people along, getting unhoused people out of public sight, but don't really do anything to improve or remedy one situation. They're not providing services, they're not providing outreach most of the time, and that doesn't make it any better for folks who are experiencing homelessness. Um, we'll note some of the pushback against criminalization as well. There have been a lot of these measures and they've been increasing, but there has also been a lot of very firm pushback from groups, organizations, individuals, people who are experiencing homelessness. In 2019, there was a settlement with the city of Denver where the city committed to providing 7 days notice of sweeps to the extent reasonably possible, except in cases of immediate public health or safety risk. So Denver should be providing a week's notice before they do a sweep or forced displacement of people who are unhoused. And in 2024, more recently, there was a effort to ban sweeps in freezing weather conditions. So during winter months, when temperature dropped below a certain temperature, um, they would not be able to sweep. And this was a measure that we supported. We wrote a letter to City Council, but ended up, even though it got through City Council, it was vetoed by the mayor's office. And there was also statewide efforts as well in the legislature a couple of years, I believe 2018, 2019. There might have been a couple other years that a statewide Right to Rest Act was brought before the Colorado State Legislature. This unfortunately died in the legislative process each year. So while there have been increasing criminalization measures, there's been a lot of pushback as well. So not only are these measures effective but ineffective, they are also really costly. There was a Denver Post report from 2021 that sort of sought to quantify how much these sweeps are really costing the city of Denver and other municipalities that enact these policies. So they found that the city of Denver spent more than 400,000 in the previous year. So I believe that was 2020. They found that Denver spent over $400,000 just on camping bans and sweeps and other measures that criminalize homelessness. Um, in 2016, the average person experiencing homelessness in Denver had about 24 contacts with police over the last 90 days. So when they surveyed people and said, over the last 90 days, how many interactions have you had? That was the number they found. And they found that it also cost the city about $4,000 per person. So this is not just the default response is to push people along. This is a choice that we're making and a thing that we're spending money on as a supposed tactic to homelessness resolution that is not effective and is still costly. Next slide, please. Thank you. We've touched on this before in past Ed series, and we've also released reports on myths and facts related to criminal justice and homelessness. But we know that there's a really direct relationship between mass incarceration and likeliness to experience homelessness. People who are unhoused are 11 times more likely to be arrested than those with housing. Again, in large part due to these ordinances and measures that make it a crime to go do these life-sustaining activities while you're unhoused. And most of these crimes are really low level and handled by municipal courts. And these are courts that are really best equipped to design with small crimes like traffic violations, ordinance violations, property damage. It can be really small things where these petty crimes are dealt with. And importantly, not all jurisdictions provide a public defender for municipal charges. So even if someone is if someone is cited under one of these ordinances, they are not always given the right to representation, which is again something our panelists will be able to speak to. And the consequences of incarceration, serving time in jail or prison can uh, lead to the loss of housing support, employment, other networks, and make it more likely that someone experiences homelessness down the line. People who have been to prison experience homelessness at a rate 7 times greater than the general population. And for those who have been incarcerated multiple times on repeat occasions, this is 13 times higher than the general population. Among youth who are experiencing homelessness, about half of them have spent time in a youth detention center, jail, or prison. So we know that the relationship goes both ways, that being unhoused makes it more likely that you are criminalized, and having experiences with the criminal legal system also makes it more likely that you can become homeless down the line. And I know if some of you are sitting here thinking, why we're not talking about more serious crime and unhoused individuals. That's correct. We are focusing more on these small measures that are unique to people experiencing homelessness. But there's also a lot of great data that shows that people who experience homelessness are more likely to be victims of crime than the perpetrators themselves, than perpetrators. And face a really high rate of victimization. About 49% of men, 48% of women have reported experiencing violence while experiencing homelessness. And in 2022, people who are unhoused were twice as likely to be the victim of a homicide than someone who was stably housed. Violence is also way more likely to be perpetrated against unhoused women and older adults who are experiencing homelessness. So again, we uneven outcomes and discrepancies even among the population. And yes, again, the crimes most often committed are property or drug related incidents, not violent crime. So violent crime uh, is not as common among this population, and increases in the size of homeless camps or encampments are not associated with increases in property crime. So a lot of the times you'll hear pushback from the media and in common narratives that homeless camps are dangerous. They're really tied to violent crime. All this crime in our city is because of people who are experiencing homelessness. And there's been a lot of data that shows that that's just not true. So what works? Why do we advocate for the housing first approach? Notably, housing first is not housing only. Permanent supportive housing connects people to wraparound services, including case management, counseling, substance use treatment, psychiatric care, medical care, and more. And there have been proven outcomes that reduce the number of police interactions and arrests when people are given housing. So we always say that it's um, all of these components that are required to regain stability are so much more difficult when you're in the midst of an experience of homelessness that being unhoused is such an immediate crisis that it makes it hard to resolve a lot of other issues. And once we give people housing, they are able to get out of some of these really uh, penal systems and penalizing measures and into solutions that work. So legality pre-grants pass. Some of you might be familiar with the recent grants pass decision from the Supreme Court earlier this year. There was a lot of legal precedent demonstrating that criminalizing people who are unhoused is unconstitutional when people have no other options. When there's nowhere else to go, what are people supposed to do except sleep outside? And courts across the country struck down multiple laws related to sleeping and camping in public and the practice of sweeps under the Fourth, Eighth Amendment, and 14th Amendment. And but there was a delicate balance. So saying that criminalization is allowable in the cases where there are viable alternatives provided to individuals. So and there's a good quote from the Department of Justice in the Bell versus Boise case that says it should be uncontroversial that punishing conduct that is a universal and unavoidable consequence of being human violates the Eighth Amendment. Sleeping is a life-sustaining activity. It must occur at some time in some place. If a person literally has nowhere to go, then enforcement of an anti-camping ordinance against that person criminalizes her for being homeless. So I think that really well articulates that if people have no other options, nowhere else to go, um, it was generally found to be unconstitutional to make that a crime. And what changed with Grants Pass? So the city of Grants Pass, Oregon, began issuing tickets to people who were sleeping in public, who were unhoused, even when there were not access to safe, accessible shelter beds. So this is generally, if there's nowhere else to go, it was generally considered unconstitutional. But in the case of Johnson versus Grants Pass, it determined that it was not cruel and unusual punishment to arrest or ticket people for sleeping outside when there is no other option. So even if there are not accessible shelter beds, this case determined that it was not cruel and unusual punishment. And due to this finding, there's been a change, and cities can now legally punish people for actions like sleeping outside and these other measures that we've talked about, even if they have nowhere else to go. So, a quick overview of what works. Again, the housing first approach can break the homelessness incarceration cycle and help people gain stability. These programs have also been found to reduce costs to taxpayers, like the social impact bond program that we launched in 2016, providing permanent supportive housing to people who were frequent users of emergency systems, found that they were housed in the long term um, and were much better off in a number of measures. We need to support and fund programs that identify housing options for people when they are discharged from jail or prison, making sure that we're not releasing people from incarceration back into homelessness. Um, making, and along those lines, making housing vouchers and supportive services programs available. Reducing barriers to housing based on criminal records. So making sure that even if someone does have a criminal record, that they are still able to access housing. Again, there's a really well-established link between criminal justice and homelessness that we need to break. And reducing police interaction. And that can include reducing interactions, especially among traditional police programs. We've talked in the past about the Denver Star program that provides a more nuanced and a more humane approach to people who are in crisis. So we need to expand those kind of programs as well. And as we always advocate for, investing in affordable housing, supportive services, better shelter options. We mentioned the social impact bond program. We found that these measures over and over again, that these programs are very effective. It's just a matter of building them to scale. So these were really effective for the people that it served, but making sure that we have more of these kind of programs for more people and doing what we know works. And overall, stop treating homelessness, mental health issues, substance use like a crime, back evidence-based solutions and public health solutions. And I think that's it for me. I can toss it back to Alexis to introduce our lovely panel for this evening.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And as I mentioned before, Andrew started with his great presentation. We'll send out the slides after this as well as the video. So if you missed anything, it'll be coming your way within a couple days. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists today. First, Alex Flood, Senior Deputy Public Defender, Denver Office of the Municipal Public Defender. Alex has worked with the Muni Defender's Office for 10 years. The Municipal Public Defender Office represents indigent defendants who are charged with criminal municipal code violations in Denver. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you.
Next, we have Emma McLean-Riggs, Senior Staff Attorney at the ACLU of Colorado, the state's oldest and largest civil rights organization. The mission of the ACLU of Colorado is to protect, defend, and extend the civil rights and civil liberties of all people in Colorado through litigation, education, and advocacy. Emma came to the ACLU of Colorado from the Office of the State Public Defender, where she was a trial lawyer in the Arapahoe Regional Office, defending the liberty of indigent accused Coloradans. Welcome, Emma. Jenny Shirley is a community advocate who works on behalf of the rights of people experiencing homelessness. Jenny is a named plaintiff in an ongoing case versus the city of Boulder. Welcome, Jenny. And finally, we have Jason Vitello, Equity and Community Development Manager for the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, or CCJRC. CCJRC is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to eliminate the overuse of the criminal justice system and advance community health and safety. CCJRC advocates and organizes for public safety strategies that are more holistic, effective, and just. Jason is the past president of the Colorado Public Health Association, a practitioner at the Public Health Institute at Denver Health, and an adjunct professor at the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver. So, welcome, Jason. So I'm going to start as we do each of these, which is just to ask everyone, now that you've seen the data presentation, is there anything that surprised you? Is there anything that you think is missing in terms of big picture of criminalization and homelessness that will help us today in our conversation? And that's for anyone who wants to join in. Okay.
Thought it was
Oh,
great.
Emma.
Sorry. I thought it was great, very comprehensive. I think the one thing that I would specify that is missing is sometimes in the criminalization space, we will talk about things that are crimes but shouldn't be crimes, which a lot of this criminalization of extreme poverty, sleeping in public, camping, that kind of stuff. And then there are also things that are actually not crimes, and things that people get hauled into court for that they did not do. And I think it's really important to acknowledge not only that people experiencing homelessness may be disproportionately likely to be charged with things that are actually crimes, but also that folks experiencing homelessness are disproportionately likely to be charged and railroaded by things that they did not do, that they were falsely accused of because of lack of access to defense counsel, because of societal prejudice on juries, societal prejudice by judges. There is also an innocence aspect here that I think is important.
Thank you so much, Emma. So Alex, I'll start with you with a specific question. You work for the Office of the Municipal Public Defender for the city of Denver specifically. Can you tell us about the kinds of cases you frequently see in your office, the types of incidents that often result in the arrest of people who are unhoused, and sort of talk a little bit about maybe sentences, fines, or penalties? I think a lot of those of us who don't work in that sector maybe don't understand the level of fines and penalties that people are getting for some of the crimes we were discussing earlier.
Yeah. Um, well, I think the tool that is used the most against unhoused folks is the trespass ordinance. I think actually there's no question in my mind that that is the law that gets most attached to folks that are unhoused, and if they follow them around everywhere they go. So you don't see many prosecutions under the camping ban, perhaps because it's slightly more complicated and harder to prove than trespassing. But if you walk around in Rhino and you are reading signs carefully, it's pretty hard to be a law-abiding human being. Of course, we don't have to worry about that too much, right? Because they're not really worried about a guy wearing a tie and a white shirt, right? But it's kind of spooky to walk around and read the signs that say no trespassing. A sign on the side of a building that says no trespassing, and the building happens to be right next to the sidewalk, and you're like, well, where am I supposed to not be? I don't quite understand. And so we see so many of those cases. So Emma's point about innocence and about like there not actually being any criminality, I think is I was so glad to hear her say that because it is true. And so I think that's what you see the most of is trespassing. But then we also get court order violations. So a person is released on bond, but they are given a court order to not exist in a certain geographic location. You'll see it all the time with Union Station. And so it doesn't matter what they're doing or who they're helping or it doesn't matter. They could be there helping somebody. It doesn't matter if they're there, they're committing a crime. So that is, the policing of their existence. And then, you see a lot of what I kind of label park violations. So Denver has a park curfew. For those joggers out there that like to jog at 4:30 in the morning, you're actually committing a crime. But no one cares, right? Um, but yeah, you can't be in a park in Denver before 5 a.m. and after 11 p.m. And then there's also this weird part of that ordinance that prohibits people from going into certain sections of the park identified by the city. And so the common one you see here is folks that are on the Cherry Creek bike path and maybe choose to stop under one of the bridges when it's pouring rain. Again, if you're commuting home from work and you do this, my guess is no one cares. But if you have nowhere else to go and you stop there, you're in trouble. So, I mean, those are the tools that I see used most against unhoused folks. Now, I think the most common sentence, I think, is jail. And I know people would disagree with that, but hear me out. What happens is few judges are going to sentence somebody to jail straight up on a trespass case. But what they will do is give them court supervised probation. And they think that they're doing the world a favor by ordering this person whose life is insanely complicated and difficult to also do community service, to like find a way to store everything that they have, to go and, you know, do what? I don't know. How does this help anyone? I have no idea. But obviously, I think judges and prosecutors and a lot of even defense attorneys kind of think that of that as like the humane alternative to jail, which I maybe, but what if they don't do it? You don't do 8 hours of community service and you got to go to jail for a few days. It's crazy and it happens a lot. So, it's just you see a huge lack of empathy or creativity about when you do have a sentence come through about what the hell makes sense. And so I do think that in the end, it may not happen right away, but in the end, I think it's going to be jail. And if folks who are really struggling, they're probably going to have more than one case. And, that jail can add up. So I wish there was another answer, but I think the answer is jail.
Thank you so much, Alex. Jenny, I have a lot of the same question for you, but just from a different perspective. As someone with lived experience, can you tell us more about the context of like the incidents that you and the people that you know, the interactions that folks are having with the criminal legal system?
Yeah, I whenever I like talk about homelessness, I always kind of like to reframe the conversation in that I don't like the term homelessness to start off with. It suggests this false idea that it's easy to fix with housing. And so I like to call us disenfranchised people. And when we're talking about criminalization, I feel like homelessness is just that extreme level of disenfranchisement that's obvious to the general public that they don't like to witness. But that is not the entirety of the situation. And when you are looking at houseless people in a form of disenfranchisement, the only way to become more disenfranchised is to become criminalized and incarcerated. And so all you're doing with criminalization is increasing that form of disenfranchisement and separating unhoused people even further away from the general population than we are already in our separation. And so if you're going to actually ever address homelessness, if this is ever going to be solved within the frameworks of this country, we're going to have to address the issues of disenfranchisement. And there's different ways that are going to have to be implemented, but absolutely none of them require additional disenfranchisement for any of these people. It's not going to help on any level. There's no additional that's not going to do anything beneficial, and it will definitely not solve the problems of the current disenfranchisement that people are already experiencing as a homeless or an unhoused person. What are they going to do when they get out of jail? Where are they going to go when they get out of jail? They're going to go right back out into the streets again. And it's just an endless cycle of incarceration and homelessness. So to me, that is an insane concept to try to propose that that's going to solve homelessness by increasing the incarceration rates of unhoused people for things that should not be illegal in the first place.
Thank you so much for that broader perspective and context. If you want to add anything about specific incidents, please do. But if you don't, that's totally fine. Do you have like incidents that you experienced or that like friends of yours like repeated things that happen?
I can tell you that I have personally never been incarcerated for anything. And
Hmm.
so I have never gotten in trouble with anything. But I have had everything that I own taken by the police more times than I can count.
Mm.
And so encampment sweeps and things like that, I have lost the vehicles that I lived in. I have lost every possession that I own. I have lost backpacks and bikes. I have lost every single thing that I have managed to acquire for myself or to try to pull myself out. It'll get taken from me. And so I take one step forward and 50 steps backward over and over and over and over again. And a lot of this is because of police interactions. And so it may not end up being a ticket or a criminal act that I end up going to jail for, but the police have destabilized me over and over again to the point to where I can no longer count how many times I've been destabilized by police interactions.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Um, so Emma, Alex gave us an idea of how municipal charges work within Denver. But of course, each jurisdiction is different. Can you tell us more about how these crimes of homelessness might be pursued in other jurisdictions in Colorado? Maybe some statewide differences in rural or urban areas, or just different jurisdictions with different leaders, of various political perspectives who may be different, making different types of laws.
Yes. So the ACLU of Colorado does not generally do direct criminal defense. We work on civil rights and civil liberties. That being said, some of the primary folks violating people's civil rights and civil liberties across the state at the moment are the municipal courts. So we are very interested in municipal courts and municipal charges. What I will say is there's a big difference between a jurisdiction like Denver and a jurisdiction like Pueblo or Grand Junction, both politically and in terms of what resources are available. So Alex was talking about how Denver doesn't really charge folks under the camping ban. My perspective is that that is a political choice. They don't charge folks under the camping ban because the camping ban is in the news, because we have sued Boulder over the camping ban, and because the camping ban is sort of overtly cruel. We we see in Denver these trespass charges, other kind of violation charges pop up because they're easier to justify, right? When you're talking to someone who's maybe politically in the center, who maybe doesn't know very much about folks who are unhoused, it's easier to say this person broke a rule and was somewhere they weren't supposed to be, like, for example, under a bridge, sheltering from the weather, than it is to say nobody should ever have a blanket. Of course, across the state, we do not necessarily have folks who have Denver's political leanings, right? So in conservative jurisdictions, we see them using things like the blanket ban aggressively. And we at the ACLU call it the blanket ban and not the camping ban because it bans things as simple as sleeping under blankets, not just the use of tents, that kind of thing. And in other jurisdictions, like in Junction in particular, we see heavy and aggressive use of the camping ban. The other piece that I want to highlight that is really important is Alex is from the Office of the Municipal Public Defender here in Denver. We do not have offices of the public defender across the state. And even where people are entitled to counsel and they're receiving counsel from individual private lawyers who are contracted, usually for very little money, to provide criminal defense to them. The quality of that criminal defense varies widely. I will not malign our brothers and sisters at the bar who are taking these contracts. There are definitely very aggressive, talented lawyers all over the state doing this work. But I do think there's something very different about an office, a public defender's office, to share skills, resources, experiences, and to be sort of oriented to the practices of the jurisdiction in a general way. So part of what we're seeing is that folks in other parts of the state are lacking the protections provided by folks like Alex in his office. And so that's an important aspect of what's happening here. I do want to call our attention particularly, and Jimmy Duffner in Q&A, I am reading your comment about Pueblo, and I would just like to highlight what's happening in Pueblo because I think it's such a good example of what Alex was talking about and what we in this profession often call the slow road to jail. So the idea that when a person first comes before the court on, say, a trespassing charge, they're given community service or probation that is impossible for them to complete. So in Pueblo, they have a sort of a spin on this, an interesting angle, as it were. The Pueblo Municipal Court has decided to charge an offense that it's calling contempt. And it charges that offense, which carries up to 364 days in jail per incident when somebody misses a court date. So let's say somebody is in court in Pueblo and they have been charged with trespass. Trespass the first time in Pueblo is not jailable. It's a fine-only offense. They are unhoused. They can't get back to court. Pueblo has very limited public transportation, and they are unable to make their court date. I have seen a court file where a person who was living on the streets called the court and said, I'm walking to court. I don't know if I can get there on time. And what the court clerk reported saying to them was, keep walking. So we're seeing an unflexible approach at the beginning. Then when they miss that court date, they're charged with contempt and sentenced to really, really long jail terms out of an offense that was not jailable to begin with. So we have talked to folks who were sentenced to 520 days in jail, to 640 days in jail for things like trespass, loitering, littering, living in an unsafe structure if someone can't afford to fix their home. So these are really obviously poverty crimes, really obviously ways to impose huge amounts of punitive jail on folks for minor offenses. And it's sort of I use the Pueblo example because I think it's a really good example of a jurisdiction that has become incredibly creative in ways that we assert are unconstitutional to punish people for the mere act of living outside when they have nowhere else to go. So we're seeing huge variety across the state and huge infractions and violations of people's rights, especially in those further out jurisdictions that have fewer protections politically and fewer protections in terms of their legal ecosystem.
Thank you so much, Emma. And if you want to know more about what's happening in Pueblo, the Denver Post did an article a couple weeks ago that we've put in the chat, and I would definitely suggest reading that to get more context from Emma and others who are involved. So to get a little bigger perspective, I'd love to turn to Jason. So your organization, the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, often works in the big picture of criminal justice reform through legislation and city and statewide policy change. Has the grants pass decision or other recent changes impacted the way that you are approaching advocacy or will be in the future?
Thank you, Alexis. Yeah, broadly would be accurate, and I want to acknowledge that we haven't spent much time doing specific advocacy work in homelessness, and our many entities, such as the Coalition, DO, and House Keys Action Networks that have a proven track record working in this specific area. But broadly, we are the No More Prisons people. Our aim is to end mass incarceration in Colorado and ultimately decrease the footprint that the criminal legal system has in our society, and really to help resource and publicly fund solutions for public health and safety that are community centered and racially just and restorative. The grants pass decision is not going to specifically define our upcoming legislative agenda, but it is part, just another piece of evidence of what we are facing now as a society, which is our insistent and incessant tendency to rely on cops, courts, and cages in addressing issues that are complex, multifaceted, and largely the result of systemic neglect and exclusion, concentrated poverty, and disenfranchisement, to Jenny's point. And I know you asked about state stuff. We're going to keep doing our thing at the state level, which is policy advocacy and reform and budget advocacy. But I'm excited to discuss what will be the focus of my work starting this coming year, which is right here in our own backyard in Denver. We like to pat ourselves on the back in Denver, but I think Denver needs to know that we are not as progressive as we think we are. We incarcerate twice as many people as Arapahoe, nearly as many people as Colorado Springs. And then it's also reflected in our budgeting decisions. Budget came out last week, I believe, and again, more of the same. We're seeing, for instance, all city agencies across Denver will not be filling vacancies as a means of cost savings, right? So no more social workers for human services or case managers for child welfare, no more staffing for DDPHE, but there's one exception, and that's the Department of Safety, right? We are committed to hiring these police and more sheriffs to staff our jails. We are investing $625 million into the Department of Public Safety, largely for increased police patrol, and the Sheriff's Department, I think, is seeing a 30% increase. Meanwhile, housing is getting 70 million, right? I mentioned that CCJRC, we're committed to publicly resourced initiatives because we can't bake sale our way out of oppression. And meanwhile, entities like Department of Corrections or Public Safety, it's like a really messed up system of incentivization where the worse they do, the more money they get. So we also learned that the budget process in Denver is there's not a lot of oversight. There's not a lot of accountability. The mayor has a lot of power in how these decisions get made. And we believe that budget documents are moral documents and reflections of our values and what's important to us. And we're living in yet another time in our history where our descendants, our children and grandchildren and historians are going to look back and ask, you guys did what to who? Right? The people who have the least amount of social capital or resources, you're putting them in cages, right? It's embarrassing. And Denver sucks too, right, when it comes to this. Homelessness, and it's not just homelessness, it's substance use and addiction and mental illness and so on. We treat these as public health issues, but in actuality, they are public, or rather we treat them as public safety issues, but really they're public health issues. And So that would be a second point of our focus is the fact that public health is not actually resourced and effectively to deal with these issues from a public health lens, right? And if you look at the Denver City Charter, at the description of DDPHE, Denver Public Health and Environment, and their roles and their responsibilities, it reads like 1950s public health. So I have an extensive background in public health as a past president of CPHA, and there's nothing in our charter that reflects the social determinants of health, health equity or racial equity, or the causal forces that create the symptoms of homelessness and mental health, and so the laundry list of everything that the Department of Public Safety is more comprehensively resourced to address. So one of the things we're looking at is what would a charter change look like? And the DDPHE, that is where it's written in that, and resourced in such a fashion that they can have a seat at the table to be a greater part of the solution making. And one of the roles of public health is to amplify the voices of those who are most impacted. That means bringing in community members who are directly impacted, making sure that they're not just at the table providing insight, but oversight of how decisions get made in addressing these issues. And then finally, looking at the narrative, we're losing the narrative war. We hear this all the time, right? Change the narrative. And it's really frustrating because in 2020, we all remember the increased awareness, the height of COVID-19, the murders of George Floyd and others, and subsequent uprising, really caused us as a society to start taking a look at the way we invest our time and resources in a lot of these issues. And since then, we have lost a lot of ground. We've seen rollbacks and regression, significant backlash, and now a regurgitation of that rhetoric, right? That get tough, war on, ... rhetoric that we know does not work. We have wasted over $1 trillion since the 1970s on the war on drugs. And what do we have to show for it? In addition to our mass incarceration rates, the biggest overdose crisis in our history, and an unstable drug supply, and so on. We have increased incarceration rates by 600%. And we are still hearing across our country, and again, right here in Denver, we need more police. We're not safe. We need more police to make us safe. So really an investment in public education and awareness, because a lot of this pressures our elected officials, from governors to mayors, AGs, city council folks who are afraid to make the decisions that need to be made related to policy and budgeting because of public perception. So decisions that are being made despite what I think are individuals who know better making decisions that are safe. So we have a role to play in making sure these individuals are held accountable. But yeah, beliefs around, we're mad at the wrong people. We're mad at migrants. We're mad at people who use drugs. We're mad at people who are unhoused, right? When that they ought not to be the focus of our attention, but that's always been the case. But ideas around what public safety is, what actually makes us safe. Is it more police, or is it greater investment in safety nets and programming and supportive and frankly housing, right? Anyway, and that's the good news, I think, is every decision. We were here because of decisions that were made by people who heard stories and believed them. We have our work cut out for us, but I believe in the power of narrative, right? Narrative can change beliefs, can change hearts and minds, which in turn can change decisions related to budget and policy, which in turn can change the material conditions of real people, which is what we're trying to do.
Thank you so much, Jason. That was a wonderfully complex answer, and really appreciate you diving in. Jenny, I want to turn to you. Can you tell us more about how you became part of the lawsuit, Feet Forward et al. Versus City of Boulder et al., and your experience being part of that case as a community advocate?
Yeah, um, just for legal purposes, I'll give a really brief kind of understanding
See
of
your
what went
lawyer
on.
nodding, like, yeah, good call.
um, I had about 3 days in a row where I had police interactions from illegal camping situations in the middle of the winter time in Boulder, Colorado, right around Christmas time. And um, I was incredibly frustrated with the situation. The interactions were incredibly hostile and unfriendly and aggressive unnecessarily. And so I I feel like I have a particular capability of being articulate and voicing things that a lot of other homeless people can't actually articulate. And so I feel like I kind of have a responsibility to fight for my fellow homeless people who are experiencing those kinds of police interactions on a daily basis, but they can't necessarily fight for themselves in the same way that I can because I have the mental clarity and the capability of vocalizing what I'm thinking and feeling in a way that most people just can't, whether it's because of mental health issues or drugs or whatever else is their issue. And so I feel like I have a responsibility to my community to fight injustices when and where I experience them because I know that if I'm experiencing it, that other people in my community are also dealing with the same thing. And so the criminalization of encampments in Colorado, particularly in the wintertime, is one of the most cruel and insane ideas that I can actually comprehend. The cruelty of it and the lack of humanity of allowing people to create shelter for themselves in an area that drops below freezing and gets snow on a constant basis. The whole concept to me, it's just so inhumane that I can't keep silent. I couldn't, there's no way that I could keep silent. We've lost community members. I've had friends of mine die. I have friends of mine that don't have fingers or toes because of frostbite and losing limbs and they can't come here and talk to you guys today. They don't have that capability. And even if they could, they couldn't articulate very well to you the issues that they're facing. And so I have this responsibility to fight for people and to make it a better solution because there's not a lot of us from our community that actually can fight for ourselves. And so you were talking about needing agency, and I think that that's probably what's needed more in homelessness management. I think homeless people need agency in their own solutions more than they need housing, more than they need wraparound services. You know, if I could get a job in homeless services, for instance, I could figure out my own poverty, but I can't even get employment within the homeless management services industry because I'm homeless. And so the entirety of my disenfranchisement, I think, is underestimated by people who don't understand the dynamics of homelessness. And so, I've created a new model that I call Equity Now. And to me, the solution to homelessness is creating enfranchisement plans that deal with people that are currently homeless for their homelessness, but preventing homeless as a primary aspect of dealing with homelessness over a long term. We shouldn't be dealing with people in tents for a long term plan of homeless management. We should be dealing with people who can't afford to pay their rent and stopping them from becoming homeless to begin with. And so homeless management should only ever be a temporary situation that we're trying to deal with to start off with. Long-term plans should be to avoid homelessness all the way around.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. Um, Emma, can you tell us a little bit more about the legal side of Feet Forward and sort of the potential impact of Grants Pass moving forward on this case and similar cases, once again acknowledging that this is active?
I sure can. So I am very honored to represent Jenny and two other folks who were experiencing homelessness at a particular time. Our folks have kind of moved in and out of being unhoused as this case has gone on. I'm very proud to say that I'm Jenny's lawyer, and she says things so much better than I ever do. So here I am to talk about that. Here's what I'll say. So Feet Forward, just for context for everybody, Feet Forward versus City of Boulder is a lawsuit brought under the Colorado Constitution under our Article 2, Section 20, prohibition on cruel and unusual punishments. So that language mirrors the language of the federal Constitution, but I think it's really important to state that the federal Constitution and the Colorado Constitution are independent sources of authority. And what I mean by that is that you have protections under the Colorado Constitution that do not depend on the United States Supreme Court's interpretation of the federal Constitution. There is a great case about this that says when interpreting the Colorado Constitution, the Colorado Supreme Court does not stand on the federal floor, it stands in its own house. So that is a fancy way of saying they can interpret that Constitution radically differently than the United States Supreme Court interprets its Constitution. We did not bring our case under any federal authority at all. We brought our case under the Colorado State Constitution only. So our position is that Grants Pass has no effect on our case. Grants Pass is at best persuasive authority. I will say that my opinion of the opinion in Grants Pass is that it is not very persuasive and that we should not be listening to it. A, because it rests on, I think, a really profound empirical misunderstanding of homelessness in the United States. And B, because I think it is a radical misread of the phrase cruel and unusual punishments. We trust that our Supreme Court here in Colorado has the capability of understanding the true facts surrounding homelessness and also interpreting our cruel and unusual punishments clause the correct way, which we believe would be to say you may not punish people for sleeping outside under a blanket or otherwise where they have nowhere else to go. I also want to touch on a little bit of what Jason said in relationship to Feet Forward. So as I said, Feet Forward is happening in the city of Boulder. And Jenny, I think very wisely, because I am always chatting to her about this, said a very abbreviated version of the facts in this case, but I will say that the Boulder Police Department treat people who are unhoused with incredible cruelty and callousness. The things that I have seen them say, not only to Jenny, but to other folks on body camera and recording, should be shocking to all of us. Boulder puts itself out as a very progressive jurisdiction. Boulder does a lot of talking about how much they wish to support people experiencing homelessness, about the diversity of their community, et cetera, in a similar way to Denver does. And in a very similar way to Denver, Boulder has used that progressive rhetoric to cloak practices that are incredibly cruel and incredibly punitive. So when I say, there's a difference between this progressive jurisdiction and this more conservative jurisdiction, I do not mean at all to hold up jurisdictions like Denver and Boulder as if they are doing the right thing, more as if they are saying the right thing and often doing the exact opposite. So I also want to flag that I saw a question and answer in the chat about the Denver Star van. I will point out, I can't speak directly to that, but I will point out that the City of Boulder has a homelessness outreach team called the HOT team, and I have seen outrageous cruelty perpetrated by that team, which is supposed to be the soft social services arm of the police. So I remain very skeptical that any police intervention is appropriate, kind, or humane in this circumstance. But yeah, sort of to summarize, I know you did ask me about the legalities of Feet Forward, and I digressed. But to summarize where we are in Feet Forward, we are bringing our suit. We believe that Grants Pass should have very little impact on our case because we are asking the Colorado courts to interpret the Colorado Constitution. They have the right to do that independently, and they have the right to do that correctly, and we expect them to do that.
Thanks so much, Emma. I'm going to turn to a couple of questions from folks joining us, and then I'll end with our planned question for the end. So Christine wants to know, what about the perception that the unhoused want to be jailed for 3 hots and a cot? And anyone who wants to jump into that, I'm going to Jenny or Alex with the head shaking no. Let's go Jenny first, if that works.
Yeah, I have known people that are like that, but it is extremely rare. And it is also a form of extreme desperation. And it's an escape mechanism trying to get away from things like snowstorms or other extreme weather events. I have known people to do that, but that is extremely shameful to assume something like that, because I can guarantee you nobody wants to go to jail. That nobody wants to lose their freedom ever.
I agree completely. I mean, I've probably heard that 4 times, and I don't know, thousands and thousands of clients. And you're right. It's often there's a blizzard outside, and this hell of a jail for in this moment is better than me wandering outside with whatever I was arrested with on. Um, so it's it is a sentence that is said, but it is extraordinarily rare.
You both.
Sorry, at risk
Nope.
of jumping in and also at risk of sounding a little sarcastic, I would invite folks who have that perception to visit the occasional jail. I heard from both Jenny and Alex, these places are hells. These places are deeply abusive, horrible to be in. Most of the time, the food is barely edible. So if someone is seeking shelter in a jail, that should reflect more on the conditions of the outside world than it does on the services provided in a jail.
Thank you, Emma. Question from Kelly is, why aren't the laws about seizure of personal property applicable to police taking belongings from unhoused people?
I actually was hoping to chime in on the last question as well.
Oh, please do. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, that is part of a larger and persistent narrative that shifts responsibility from social responsibility to personal choice, right? We like to point our fingers at the criminal legal system, but one of my favorite things is reminding behavioral health care professionals and public health and health and human services, all the ways that all of our systems are complicit in creating the narratives and the structures that have kept oppression in place for so long, right? So social work, its origins were in people like Jane Addams and other predominantly white women going into urban centers and providing assistance and resources to the urban poor, but in addition to assistance and resources, moral instruction, because these were people who were poor because of their moral failings. And then something happened in the late 20s and 30s. Our economy tanked, right? And people who are rich and people who are middle class were suddenly impoverished. And then poverty was no longer a moral failing or a consequence of personal choices or bad decisions. This is this is a social issue and we need a safety net, right? And there's evidence of how this plays out throughout our history, right? Look at well, I could go on and on, but it's really about the way we other individuals, right? We in our society, we other people who use drugs, we other people who are unhoused, um, and only because we're self-interested, we only seek solutions for problems often when they directly impact us.
Thank you so much, Jason. Um, I'll just repeat the question of some Kelly's question about seizure of personal property and why that isn't applicable with police taking belongings from unhoused people. No one on here's area of expertise, I don't think, but if anyone wants to take a stab.
I sure do wish somebody would know an answer to that one because this is a really, really big problem. But there doesn't seem to be any legal representation to help people get any belongings back or to make anyone accountable for any loss of personal items or value to any of the personal items. So there is no accountability for this ever. I have never heard of any accountability for people getting their things back anywhere. So I don't think there's anybody focusing on that.
Thanks, Jenny. Well, I'll go ahead to our last question that we had planned, which is, about actions, right? So those who join us for this often want to know what a community member can do. Maybe they work in the sector, maybe they're a community member, maybe they're housed, maybe they're unhoused. What can we do to assist each other, assist our neighbors, and impact greater policies? What do you recommend folks do to impact change? And whoever would like to start. If everyone's thinking, I'll do a quick CCH answer, which is that we always recommend people join the advocacy network if you do want to advocate, and it gives you opportunities to testify on issues that we're doing. And some of those are like Jenny was talking about, upriver solutions. So we're trying to prevent people from eviction. We're trying to keep renters housed. So we're looking for people to testify. We're looking for people to send messages. You can always do that. We also are working on the Affordable Denver ballot measure that we would encourage folks to vote yes to who are in Denver to increase tax a very small amount, 5 cents for every $10 in order to provide more affordable housing. And we will have a ballot guide out in the next month or so to look about coalition policies on other things. So I will take advantage of my own question there. I apologize, but I have the panelist power and it makes you a little crazy. So, anyone else?
I just want people to be a little bit more patient with homeless people in general, be a little bit more empathetic. If you see somebody panhandling, give them $1 if you have it and don't judge where they're going to spend it. If you see somebody sleeping on the road, don't be afraid of walking past their tent. A little more understanding, a little more empathy goes a long way. Just listen to somebody. Simple.
Please join the CCGRC mailing list. It'll stay apprised of the Denver campaign as it rolls out, as well as what we're up to on the state level. We are always committed to giving platforms for our members to engage. And one of the questions in the chat was around public awareness of budgeting decisions. I think there's just so much that people don't know. we know we spend a lot on Department of Safety, for instance, but when you look at the pie and see that it's 40%, uh, right, or more, and it's not just what we're spending our money on when we do that; it's what we're not spending it on, right? When we're not spending it on economic opportunity or education or housing or mental health and substance use programming and on and on. That's why we're here. Also, holding our electeds accountable. I think a lot of decisions that are made by people who know better are based in fear, but they should know from their constituency, whether that's local or the state level, that we got your back, right? And we're tired uh, of this SOS, same old ish, and these decisions. And yeah, it's not just about staying aware of what's going on and just being ticked off all the time, but actually taking action and finding ways to engage. And that's going to look differently depending on, maybe your focus area or your interest areas or where you work. But I think staying engaged in capacities that make sense for you are it's also important. Thanks.
I would say, from my perspective, as I have gotten more interested in municipal courts and in municipal crime, generally, city council meetings, going to your city council meeting, contributing in your city council meeting. I think that that's my sort of latest soapbox, is engaging in not only your state level politics, but your local politics, especially because my experience of most local political spaces is that they tend to be very anti the interests, agency, and autonomy of unhoused folks. And so having voices that can center the narratives and experiences of unhoused people and uplift them, as well as to advocate for them in spaces they may not have access to, really, really important. So going to your city council meetings, following your local political activity, really important. The other thing that I would say is that your elected officials do listen to you, especially in clumps, in groups, if there are lots of folks contacting them. And they do often listen more to folks where they have, say, 15 people who've written them about on one side of an issue and 0 folks on another side of an issue. They do think about that. So reaching out and talking to your elected officials, really important. I'm not going to plug the ACLU. I'm going to assume that y'all can find it, and we've already dropped one of those links in the chat. But we obviously appreciate your support and engagement as well. But more than that, go to your local city council meeting. That's what I'd advise you to do.
Alex, any thoughts you'd like to add?
No, I mean what I always come back to is just, and I don't know how you get there, but the idea of enforcement and even prosecution of these folks, I just think needs to be completely reconsidered. I understand that there's always going to be situations where some kind of intervention is called for by, someone who feels like they themselves are unsafe and they themselves are going to call 911. But then hopefully at some point, uh, people can intervene in a way that is sensible and not just cut a ticket, hand it to the person, and then watch the system just chew up an individual for no reason. There's no reason why a person sleeping under a bridge actually needs to be prosecuted for sleeping under a bridge. I understand, I'm even willing to concede that there may be situations where someone needs to go talk to that person, but then the many, many court appearances, the money, the jail, all of that is, in my mind, I just don't understand the point. Why are we better off turning that ticket into a conviction and a 3-day jail sentence or a 4-day jail sentence or a probation sentence? That doesn't help anybody. And it just puts the burdens of poverty on the people that have no ability to pay for it. And it's it's terribly sad, and it's hard to not, you know, it's hard to keep some hope because the system can just absolutely crush people and no one cares. Except for, obviously some folks care plenty.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our amazing panelists tonight. You all were great. Really covered the topic incredibly well, and I think we all are in a better place of understanding now. So thank you all so much. As always, I really also want to thank the attendees. I know that this isn't how everyone chooses to spend their Thursday night, is learning more about this topic. So thank you for engaging. Thank you for learning. Please share the video, share your thoughts, tell people. As we learned in this, both, data is full, like tells you that it's all misconceptions, that we are not safer when we criminalize homelessness and criminalize the disenfranchised. And so please share this information because this is what is actually true. I also will just mention that next month we'll have our next episode in the education series. It's on youth and teen homelessness, and we're once again going to be talking about those institutional causes and proven solutions. So really hope you all can join us. It is not the third Thursday of the month. We're just throwing you off. It is the fourth Thursday of the month. So please do join us for that. If you're able to, it'll be on Zoom once again, so very accessible, and then once again available online after. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to the education and advocacy team at the Colorado Coalition for being with us. And if you have questions, please just email us. You should have Gabriella's email from the Zoom link. We can put mine in the chat. Hit us up on the social media, and please stay connected. So thank you all so much.